economic geography in the Faculty of Spatial Sciences here in Groningen. And I'm also the academic program director of the Islands program. And I'm really excited that we have this collaboration, second time this year, with Rudolf Agricola School, bringing Danny Dorling to Groningen. And also to be back in a Studium Generale event. We had Danny Dorling here back in 2018, also on, in an event on the impact of inequality. And today we have a follow-up of that. So a few words. This collaboration is aimed at engaging with issues pertaining to sustainability, environmental, but also social. Social sustainability, inequality is something that is a threat to social cohesion and social sustainability, and it is something we study in both the Rudolf Agricola School and the Islands program on islands and sustainability, also using islands as particular case studies to study social cohesion, amongst other things. And in this context, we engage with Millennium Development Goals. Inequality is number 10, I think, reducing inequality within countries and between countries. And it is a very important topic. It could be seen as an adverse social weather. It's bad for our well-being and happiness. And this was actually the topic in 2018. We looked at inequality as something that is detrimental to well-being. And it is fantastic to have with us Danny Dorling, who is one of maybe the leading scholar in inequality, especially in the context of geography. He holds the Harvard Mackinder Chair in Geography at the University of Oxford. And he has, I think this year, 56 books, over 300 academic publications in peer-reviewed journals, including top medical journals, and including work that looks at how inequality is detrimental to our health. And Danny's work in relation to inequality, I think he does a couple of books a year. He does Inequality in the 1%, Injustice, and last year he talked about Shattered Nation in Britain, and this year he will talk about 7 children, more than that in a moment. And I know Danny for quite some time. I met Danny, as you might tell from my name and my accent. I'm originally from Greece. But I moved to England in the late 90s, and I did my PhD there at the University of Leeds, and that's where I met Danny. And I would like to say a brief anecdote linking to today. One of the big cultural shocks for me in the UK, in England, was to see homeless people. I've never seen a homeless person in my life before. In going from Greece to the UK. So the UK, especially places like London, very wealthy cities, but also inequality, poverty. So that's something that you could see as social weather. Since then, things have changed massively. Now we have, unfortunately, poverty and homeless people in Greece, in my home country, including in islands like Lesbos. And this is something that clearly it's detrimental to well-being, not just for the people who are poor, but also everyone, even the rich people. It's quite established now. It's bad social weather, you could argue. So Danny's work has been engaging with that for quite some time. The book that he will talk about today is on the lives of 7 fictional children, but also using real data to paint the picture of that. And it's fantastic that we have with us also Sander van Lanen, who is one of the people I first met here in Groningen. We started working together in 2017. And Xander's work, Xander is a rising star in social geography and inequality. He has done really inspiring work also for me. And in social geography, poverty, and I think interestingly, I would say his work, his most recent work, uses theater and theater methods to study poverty, energy poverty, and again in a way it's like fictional but real at the same time. So Xander will discuss with Danny the work. Danny will focus on the UK, but it's relevant to any country here, that people come from different places, mostly from the Netherlands, but we can think of the 7 children where we come from. And Xander will focus on the Netherlands and how this relates to the Netherlands. So we'll have a discussion. Danny will start with about 20 minutes talking about the book. Then Xander will react to that, about 15 minutes or so. Then we'll have a conversation between them. And then we will open the floor to discussion. I have on my notes 2 volunteers from the Islands program and the Research Master program from our faculty. I hope they will have a question. I think I can identify them. But anyone is, of course, welcome. But it would be nice to also have some questions from the students. And also anyone here, Studium Generale is about engaging with society, anyone is welcome, of course, to ask questions and engage in the discussion. So I think I should stop here. Thank you very much for coming. And Danny, I would like to give you the floor. I didn't forget to give you the...
Thank you. Thank you ever so much for the invite. Thanks for coming tonight. I have no slides, which for me is quite scary. If you get bored and you've got a phone, you can Google 7 children. If you've got very good eyesight, that's what the book looks like. If you Google 7 children, there's a website. There are some graphs. I'm not making up this data. Let's start off with one thing I learned tonight, which is about Sander's interested in theatre and how you can use theatre. This book is half fiction. My advice to anybody who's an academic is don't try to write fiction. It's much, much harder than you think. It's easy to write non-fiction, which is what I mostly do, because non-fiction, you simply try and write the truth. And if you're old-fashioned like me, there is only one truth. Every sentence is either correct or wrong, and that's what you do. Fiction is much harder because you're creating a world that partly isn't real, and it has to be consistent. So you can't suddenly decide that somebody has another brother or sister, or their father does a different job. You have to create a consistent world. Now that may sound easy, but it's very difficult. So this was a book that was quite hard for me to write, which explains why there aren't many books like this. It was also very hard to find a publisher, because publishers will not publish a book which is half non-fiction and half fiction. There are hardly any out there, because if you're an editor of a publisher, you're either a non-fiction editor or a fiction editor. There are 2 kinds. So it's a little bit different. And why try to do something a little bit different? Because we've become, in the UK at least, ground down by being told stories about inequality and poverty, because it's gone on for so long. Theatre, I want you to try to imagine something. And this is actually a one-man show done by a theatre company in Sheffield called Third Angel. So you have to imagine that I could act and I can't. And we'd make the whole room go dark, and then behind me will appear a photograph. And on the photograph are 30 children, and they're aged about 6 years old. And there's a spotlight, and I'm sitting on a chair like this. And I'm going to tell you who the children are. The 30 children are the 30 children of the class I went to in school in 1973. They're the children I learnt to read and write with. And what we're going to do is I'm going to tell you that I've been to visit as many of these children as I can find because of Facebook, you reconnect. And I'm going to tell you some of the stories of their lives. What happened to them. And the spotlight will go onto one child and I'll say, she is now 56. They're all 56. We were in the same class at school. This is what's happened to her. This is when the first marriage ended. This is when she got this job, when she had a child, what happened to that child. The spotlight might appear on another child and I'll say, they're not here anymore. And I won't tell you much more about why. It's incredibly effective. If you think about your own school at age 5 and what might have happened to your friends and the distribution of the good and bad luck in their lives, or just your family, and if I was a better actor, you could begin to feel the emotions about life and chance. Now, the key factors that matter for what happens to people are when they are born, which year they're born in. If you're born 18 years before a world war and you're a boy, that's not good news, right? Generally, if you're born later, That's good news, because in general we get progress. People get taller, they get better fed, we become nicer, we reduce bigotry, we're less racist, we're less sexist, generally. This is where you're going to get the bad news, I'm afraid, in a bit. And then where? Which place in the world? Which country are you talking about? So first of all, when, and then where? Now, my cohort, we were born in 1968, we didn't have it too bad, at least for those of us born in the south of England. We actually had it incredibly good. My cohort, we were born in the city of Oxford. The local hospital had the first baby incubators in the world. So we actually had the lowest infant mortality on the planet where I was born. We had the best health service in the world at that time. The National Health Service, the outcomes were better than any other health service. There were a few countries, tiny countries, with higher life expectancy. But the United Kingdom had a greater population than all those countries put together and had almost as high life expectancy. So children's health, middle-aged health, the health of older people was better than almost anybody else in the world in the place I was growing up. Doesn't mean it was good compared to now, but it was better. Housing. Around half my friends lived in social housing and council housing. You didn't necessarily know they did. There wasn't that much of a distinction. There were social distinctions. If you know Britain, people were much more likely to be watching ITV. I actually thought as a child, ITV, commercial television, was supplied to council houses and not to mortgaged houses, because middle-class families disapproved of this TV channel. But there wasn't much difference. There was a cohort born in 1946, that is a set of children born in a week who we followed for their whole lives. All the evidence you hear about if you drink a glass of wine, you'll live longer, all the serious stuff about that comes from these cohort studies. The cohort of people born across the whole UK in 1946, a majority of them lived at one point in their childhood in social housing. So social housing in the UK, before I was born and up to I was born, was a majority tenure for children. Safe, secure housing you could not be evicted from, of better quality than the slums that it had replaced. If you go back to my grandfather's generation, 90% were living in private renting. And then education, again for me in the UK. We just, at secondary school level, for the first time in our history, decided it was okay for all children, almost all children, to be taught at the same schools. We introduced a strange word, it was there before, but it was introduced in the 60s, called comprehensive schools, where you all went to the same schools. I didn't have to take an exam at age 11. I couldn't read a word when I was 8 years old. I was the last child in this class of 30 to learn to read. You can guess why I couldn't read. No, there's a word for it now. There wasn't a word then, but it didn't matter very much because we all went to the same school and you didn't worry too much about if a boy couldn't read till later. But if I'd been made to take an exam at 11, which had existed before, I would be at the bottom of the class. I could only barely read at 11. I could do maths. I couldn't read because I was slow at that. But I was lucky. I was in that education system where we went to the nearest school. We fought about each other more than we ever had in this country, that we were equals. We treated each other well. Almost all the children had a holiday every summer. There was full employment. People could start families in their 20s if they want. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't great if you were a woman. It wasn't great particularly if you were black or Asian. But it was better than it had ever been, and it was better than almost anywhere else in the world. and now it is different in the UK. The book, 7 Children, begins with 7 children born in the autumn of 2018, when I was last here. It wasn't chosen because I was last here then, it was chosen because the autumn of 2018, if we are lucky, may be the peak of our inequality, as measured by the gap between us, the income gaps between us. When I was a child of large European countries, only Sweden was more equal. The UK was more equal than the Netherlands. The gaps between people were less. I grew up in a Scandinavian country called England. Right? Try to imagine that's where we were on the social measures. We were bang in the middle of those countries. And then, towards the end of the 1970s, we tried an experiment. The experiment is now called Thatcherism. We followed the Americans, we followed Ronald Reagan. We lowered taxes, we took away state support, we let industries die, we let 3 million people be unemployed, we allowed people to become homeless. We took away benefits from 16 and 17-year-old children so that they might also become homeless. There was almost no homelessness when I was growing up. There were 2 or 3 old men on tramping routes. I only saw 2 or 3 old men in my city homeless. When I was last here, and I probably said it, Oxford had the 2nd highest death rate in the UK of homeless people. I could go through the names and the numbers of people who are dying on the streets of Oxford in 2018. The pandemic did some good things. We housed everybody who was homeless in the pandemic. We didn't do that because we were nice. We did it because we thought there were going to be a sink for the disease that was going to kill us all, if you can remember back then. So we suddenly put everybody into hostels. And some things did get better. Autumn 2018. Going to write a book about 7 children. And I'm good at maths. I'm not good at reading and writing. There were 14 million children alive at that time. So what I decided to do was to group those 14 million. Imagine if you line them all up. If I always threaten audiences, we'll do this with you. We'll just get you to, all you've got to do, you two, is quietly talk to each other about how much money you had in 2024. And if you had more than you swap. Right? Within 10 minutes, we can have all the rich people there and all the poor people there. And I'm sure you're not like the English. I'm sure you don't mind. Maybe. Okay? Anyway, we could do this statistically. So we line up all the 14 million people. The child who has in a family with the least is down there. The child in the family at the most is down there. We group them into 7 groups of 2 million, and we take the middle child of each. So I'm going to ignore the million poorest children, and I'm going to ignore the million richest. I'm going to take the middle child, because these are 7 typical children. They're called Anna, Brandon, Candice, David, Emma, Freddie, Gemma. They're real for me. You don't spend 3 years writing a book about children. But their lives are statistical constructs so that they have exactly the right number of siblings to add up to national distribution. I don't tell you their ethnicity and races because you can't represent that with just 7 children, but you might guess or presume, but at no point in the book are you told. To make it easier for me, they go girl, boy, girl, boy, girl, boy. That was easier. I don't tell you where they live because I don't want to stereotype particular parts of the United Kingdom. But I do tell you their circumstances. And I think I've got about 5 minutes or so. Yeah. The first child, Anna, wasn't the name originally given her, by the way. The publisher had me change the name. The name was Adowa. But I can't actually pronounce it correctly, so it's very lucky the publisher said I had to change it. It's spelled A-D-J-O-A, like Adjoa. Publisher's very concerned about am I stereotyping people with names. Anyway, she's called Anna. Anna was the name of my first girlfriend. But also, in case you didn't know, Anna or Anne was the most popular girl's name in the world in the past. Half the women in Wikipedia 200, 300, 400 years ago were called Anna or Anne. Anyway, she's called Anna. Her mother works as a senior healthcare worker, looking after people in old age. Her dad doesn't live with the family. The income after paying taxes and after getting benefits is £118 a week. That pays for the family, mum and the child. That pays for food, clothes, bus tickets, mobile phone bills, mobile phone. You have to have a mobile phone, mum does. Anna is just a toddler, a child, which makes writing fiction easier because she doesn't speak, but her mother does. £118 a week, if you take it back by inflation, is the equivalent of £1 a week in 1913. This matters because in 1913, a very famous book was written in England called Around About £1 a Week, about how the respectable poor lived and how they survived at the time of our greatest inequality, which was around then. How they got food, how their nerves of their mothers were worn to fiddlesticks, how some survived, how some fell apart. How do you manage to clothe your children? How do you keep any kind of respectability going on £1 a week? The poorest seventh of children, 2 million children in the UK, are living on the equivalent amount of money that they were 110 years ago. Yes, they've got a mobile phone, or their parents have, but that's essential to life. Right? It's the same as being able to send a letter in the past, which you needed to do sometimes. Yes, they might have slightly better heating. Yes, they'll probably get vaccinations when they're born, which of course didn't exist and nobody got in the past. But in terms of the very basics, in terms of food and not going hungry and clothing, nothing has changed in 100 years, but only for the very worst off. You go up the scale. Brandon has 3 brothers and sisters. His parents don't work, or do a tiny bit of work, but don't do so much work that they don't fail to qualify for benefits. And it's very, very complicating making sure you can qualify for benefits in the UK. They just get by. But Brandon's sister, who qualifies for free school meals, goes hungry because she can't work out how to get the correct combination of food at school that allows her to use her free school meal voucher, because the private company that supplies the food has designed things such that it's almost impossible to do. I have real stories mixed with statistics in this. These things happen in the country. We go up and up and up, and I'll spoil it for you if you get it, but so child number 7. Child number 7, Gemma, she has a sister. Her parents run a corner shop. There's a shop at the end of the street. They run it quite well. They're careful. They do all the work. After taxes, after paying for housing, which is the flat above the shop, Mum and Dad each bring in £25,000 a year. Think 25,000 euros. £50,000 in total in disposable income. £1,000 a week instead of 118. But £50,000 income for a family. 50,000. That puts you in the top 7th in the UK now. And most people who read the book are better off than that, because it's only well-off people who buy books nowadays, right? Because they cost money. It's only well-off people who buy a cup of coffee for £5.50. And we don't mix, so we don't know what these differences are. Because this is England, Gemma's mum and dad, or Gemma's dad who wants it, are thinking about paying for Gemma to go to a private school. If you didn't know, 7% of children in the UK go to private schools. 30% of all the money we spend on children's education at that age goes to these private schools. So if you can pay, your child's going to get all this attention, and they're going to get A's, unless they're not very, very slow. And you buy them. And also you buy your child not having to mix with all the other children. Because even though our schools are segregated by area, there's still a chance or a danger that if you don't pay for your child to go to a private school in England, they might mix with some of these others. But they can afford for one of their daughters to go private and not both, so they probably won't. Where's all the money gone? The UK has become poorer, particularly after Brexit. That didn't help, it turns out, but we've done you all a favour in case you want to know what happens if you leave the EU. You know, somebody had to do it and show. It's not good, there's no benefits, but we did it. I always tell Demetrius we saved Greece. Nobody, there's almost no far-right political party in Europe now arguing to leave. Have you noticed that? Yeah? The things the British have done for the world. Sorry. Where's all the money gone? Now, if you remember, I told you I'm not talking about the poorest million. So I'm not talking about children who got a parent in prison. We have more children with parents in prison than all the rest of the children in Europe combined. We have more children excluded from school, but not that, they're in the bottom million. The bottom million includes children whose parents go to soup kitchens, ones who are homeless, or in bed and breakfast, 100,000 a year. I'm not talking about them, but more importantly, I'm not talking about the best off million out of 14 million, the best off 1 million out of 14. Their families, and this is my family, and every other university professor's family, our families are taking a third of all the national income. We leave just 2/3 for the 7 typical children, which is why the child who's number 7, mum and dad run a corner shop and they have £50,000 a year to spend on food and clothes and soap and a holiday, but they don't have a holiday because they're running a corner shop. And so on. They're doing okay. They're getting the same as the poorest 3 children, but they're not rich. Because when you're really unequal, nobody feels like they're doing okay. So I should begin to bring this to an end. If you notice there are, for those with really good eyesight, there are 8 columns on the front of the book. This is because the publisher, when I said, please can you change it to 7, told me it looks better with 8. The publisher was very good at English as a child. My lovely editor did a degree in English. Publishing houses are full of people who are good at English, but not very good at maths. But I've reconciled myself that the 8th column is for the better off children. And in fact, if that was the 1%, it would actually be going and hitting just below the ceiling. But it's meaningless because that's the average for the 1%. It's about 621,000 a year as compared to 50. Think of Boris Johnson's children. When Boris became Prime Minister of England, you know, Boris, all right, jolly chap, went to Eton, my age, was in my hometown when I was 16. He was frightened of going out, by the way. When Boris became Prime Minister, he became poor because the Prime Minister's salary of about 170, he never had to live on 170,000. He couldn't even afford his own wallpaper. But when he stops being Prime Minister, he's back to $500,000 a year, even more, because he could do speeches. I live in the world of these salaries. I live in the world of academics on 60, 70, 80, 90, maybe 120. The world of people who work in publishing, the world of people who work in AI in London, the world of families rich enough to send their children to universities that charge very high fees. That's my world. And it isn't the world of my country. I have a friend from Finland who does talks about what they do in Finland, and he always starts his talks by saying, I'm not going to tell you what you should do. He's the person who did more to end homelessness in Finland than anybody else. He just tells you what they did in Finland. If you want to know about education in Finland, what they did is they came to the UK in the 1960s, looked what we did, copied it, did it properly, and created the best education system in the world. If you want to look at health in Finland, again, it's incredibly good. Oh, Finland, lowest infant mortality rate in the history of the species. I can boast about my hometown in 1968, but not an entire country. But he says, I'm not going to tell you what to do, and I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm sure we'll talk about the Netherlands. I know a little bit, but obviously not much. All I want to do is tell you what not to do, and what happens if you do it wrong. And what happens if you do it wrong, and this is the misery I promised, is that your children actually begin to get shorter. Demetrius mentioned I was involved in writing articles in medical journals. These articles used to be so complicated, difficult measures in the Tony Blair years to suggest that things weren't getting better. If you remember, things can only get better. Turns out they didn't. It used to be hard. Now we just have to measure the heights of our children in England, and we see that they're going down. Now we just count the number of dead children each year and see it's going up. Right? Now we measure how many people go seriously hungry, and we find that in England, a majority of children who've got a brother and sister, 56%, are going hungry, not just peckish, probably hungry 3 or 4 times a month. And people become afraid of each other. And your voting becomes wild. And your political parties move right and right and right. And your Labour Party becomes the Conservative Party with conservative policies. And it pushes your Conservative Party so far to the right that it has to leave the European Conservatives in 2014 and ally itself with a group with Alternative for Deutschland. Our Conservative Party became a far-right party. And you saw that in our prime ministers, in Sunak and in Johnson and so on. We get a new far-right party getting bigger. We always had it. It was the National Front, the British National Party, the Brexit Party, now Reform, which does so incredibly well at the election that we're now frightened that Nigel Farage, possibly in alliance with the Conservatives, will sweep the board in 4 years' time. And you will be looking across the water at something not dissimilar to the United States and Trump. That's a possibility in the UK. The great news in the UK is that nobody anymore argues ever that we've done a good job. That's ended. And that's good, but I do think it matters to show what actually happens if you let your country become the most unequal country in Europe and get poorer on top of that. And the result is very, very bad indeed. I think these 7 children are going to have a good life because the children born at the last peak of inequality, around about 1913, 1918, had incredibly good lives. Things actually got better for them in almost every decade. There was full employment when they became adults, a health service in their old age. They were a lucky generation. But unless we do something about it, that's not going to happen. And if other countries in Europe do not look at what's happened at the UK, the poorest fifth of people in the UK are now poorer than the poorest fifth in most countries in Eastern Europe. We have become poorer for most of our people than most of Eastern Europe. There are only 5 countries in Eastern Europe now which have a higher neonatal mortality rate than the UK. You really can sink that very low. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you very much. Now we can move on to reflections and reaction from Xander van Lanen. So, Xander, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Danny, and your book on 7 children, inequality, the next generation. where you try to explore what inequality means for those children growing up, right? And I find it interesting reading it because I know you as a quantitative researcher working with numbers, etc. And now you try to put some meat on the bones of those numbers of what it means and try to summon humanity behind those numbers. Myself, I'm a qualitative researcher working on similar topics of poverty and inequality, which basically works the other way around. I gather stories and then I go to statistics to see if those stories match up. So I think it's nice that we kind of now meet each other in the middle, or here at this table at least, to talk about these. I want to share 3 reflections that I had after reading the book and hearing you talk. But I think first I would like to think a bit about what your book might look like, how it might be contextualized for the Netherlands. Because the Netherlands is still a relatively equal country, at least when it comes to income. When it comes to wealth distribution, I think only the United States is more unequal within the OECD countries. But for income, it's relatively equal. Dutch inequality, social exclusion, and poverty are below European Union averages. And it's not so easy to compare it to the UK anymore because you're no longer in the European surveys because of Brexit. But we're still doing better in the UK as well. But nonetheless, income inequality is slowly but steadily increasing in the Netherlands. And a significant part of that has been fiscal changes, so changes in taxes and spending in the last 20 years. Now, every year, the CBS, the Dutch Statistical Agency, publishes or organizes Pen's Parade, the Parade of Pen. I don't know if you've heard about it. It's a quite interesting exercise where they sort all the households in the Netherlands by income, and then they do something with average height, but I'll skip that part. They organize them and then let them parade by in an hour. And then it gives an indication of what the average income is of a household, the group of households that passes within every minute. So you get kind of 60 groups of people with average incomes. And the most recent parade was in 2022, when the average household income was 35.4 thousand euro. And then during the first minute, the household income, average household was 1.1% of the average, and the 16th minute, so the last minute, was 465% of the average, so 4.5 times the average. The equivalents of your children would pass by in minutes 4, 12, 21, 30, 38, 47, and 55, which means that they live in households with incomes ranging from 14.7 thousand euros a year net incomes to 55.9 thousand euros a year. And like in the UK, you can then see these do not include the super rich, and probably a lot of us are at least in those final minutes. If you would compare all these households that march by to the official poverty line, it means that all single households that would pass before the 8th minute live in poverty. All single parents with 2 children that pass before the 28th minute live in poverty, and all couples with 2 teenagers that pass before the 36th minute live in poverty. But of course, these households are not evenly distributed, right? There's single parents, different households across the line. Currently in the Netherlands, 540,000 people live in poverty, and 1.2 million live just above the poverty line. And this is after the recent redefinition of poverty you might have seen, which miraculously suddenly cut the number of poor people in half. Which was the goal of our current government, or previous government, reduce half poverty. I hope they're not going to get away with statistical tricks as easily. I hope not. In the Netherlands, around 4 to 6% of households live in poverty. It's a little bit blurred because the last figures are from 2022 or 2023, when people on low income got the energy allowance of 1,300 euros, which pushed a lot of people just above the poverty line. So you see a sudden reduction, which is even more interesting in long-term poverty, where you enter when you're poor for 4 years in a row. Now suddenly a whole cohort gets taken out because they peak above the line for 1 year. It means that in the next 4 years you are not long-term poor. According to UNICEF, 7.1% of children grow up in a poor household, and also a figure which is slowly increasing. So the Netherlands is nowhere near the United Kingdom, and we can and we should learn and discuss where we want to go and think how we want to get there. That was a bit of my contextualization. I didn't delve as detailed as you did because I didn't have the time to write a whole book, only to prepare a presentation.
Thank you.
The first point I wanted to make is, you already touched upon it. It surprised me that all 7 children lack things in a way. Now, Sunday's child, the most affluent of the 7, doesn't go on holidays, but that's also because of the corner shop, which says something about inequality and our perceptions of it. It means that extreme wealth really concentrates at the top and among a small number of households. But I also think, and the way you discuss it, is it invites a little bit to talk about how we measure poverty, or maybe better, how we measure social inclusion and what it means to get along. Because when we talk about poverty, we often talk about a person or a household that is not having enough money. And poverty definitions reflect this. Like the poverty line in the Netherlands is a certain income. And it also shapes how we perceive poverty. But if you look at the United Nations defines poverty, and their definition doesn't even mention money. The United Nations definition is the inability to meet primary needs to live with dignity. It doesn't mention money. Your capability to meet needs and whether you achieve that or not. I think in your book, you start to make steps towards thinking about poverty as an inability to make a set of needs, because you stress for these kids what they can and what they cannot do. It starts with income and then illustrates the consequences for need satisfaction. And these needs include food, housing, clothes, holidays, social participation, etc. And it's true, of course, that in our societies, we fulfill most of our needs by money, right? We buy our food, we rent our house, we hire a cleaner, and we use money to do those things. But I'm sometimes afraid that if we see poverty only as a lack of money, it also means that our solutions will always be to increase people's income. So then at the individual level, we can see training as a way to get people into work or a better paying job. We can increase allowances or increase benefits. At a societal level, we think about arguments to increase the minimum wage, to reduce taxes on work, or to increase benefits. And while these are very important, I think the focus on money might sometimes result in a loss of sight of the role that services can play, services and facilities. Because if we think about poverty as an inability to meet certain needs, we can also think about other ways to meet those needs, including expanding social housing to provide quality housing opportunities, as you mentioned, from the time you grow up. Free public transport can make people go around and reach services rather than having to pay for a ticket. And for example, the gemeente Hogeland here in Groningen started giving free public transport for people under the social minimum. And the city of Istanbul, since a few weeks, offers free public transport to unemployed people. We can reduce or abolish fees for education and healthcare. And all of this can, without giving people extra money, do mean that they are capable of meeting certain needs regardless. And sometimes this is also simpler to organize. Think about how we organize and finance our health system in the Netherlands. It's like you pay to one organization and you get a means-tested allowance from the other. It's all complicated and things can go wrong, and sometimes it's just easier to provide a service for free. My second point, and related to that, is that if you shift the focus from income to need satisfaction, it also opens up our perspective to include interactions between formal and informal care. So what kind of support is received from official institutions and organizations, but also from family, friends, and neighbors. And I think your first child receives a Christmas present every year from her father, right? That's one form of informal care, and a way for me to prove I read the book. So formal care that's often given by institutions can work through benefits, and that's then also giving money again, or sometimes providing certain services for free. Informal care includes assistance by neighbors, friends, family, volunteers. Someone might be unable to afford a car, but if their sister lives in the same street and can occasionally drive them somewhere, then maybe this is not that big of a problem. They can still be mobile. Or they have a handy neighbor that can help fix a toilet or a squeaking door, or a friend that might look after your children rather than you having to pay for a babysitter. At the same time, I think we should watch out not to romanticize informal care or believe that informal care will always step in when formal assistance is absent. But I think informal care does help people to meet some of those needs. And if we have this needs-based perspective on poverty rather than money perspective, it opens up including that in how we think about it. I believe it's important to consider ways of organizing assistance to people in poverty and social exclusion so that formal care can support and strengthen informal care where it works, but at the same time guarantee care availability even when you have no friends around, when you have no family or a better relationship with your family. You shouldn't become abandoned on that. And finally, I do want to talk about geography, Danny. We are both geographers, and in your book you explain, in your talk you did too, that you're not looking into geography because you don't want to prevent stereotyping certain places. And I fully understand that. I sometimes, working a lot on poor places, I really struggle with this. But I think if we consider poverty and inequality beyond having enough money, once we start looking at formal and informal strategies to make ends meet, then geography matters. Right? If you live in a city, then maybe your friends and your family might live in walkable or cyclable distance and they can support you or help you in any way. When the job center, the youth club, the library, and the food bank are easy to reach, you can more easily use them. But others might live in a village or a small town, and the bus arrives only 3 times a day. There's only a small corner store to attend. Where going to school, the library, and the doctor means having a drive or having to take the bus. Having less resources in one place is not the same as living in another place with more resources. And you do mention tremendous spatial inequalities in the UK in your book. So I think in terms of poverty and the resulting inequality, I was wondering how you think kind of personal and spatial policies to deal with those might relate to each other. Maybe that comes back in the discussion. Now, these were my 3 reflections, 3 points. Thank you for showing us inequality in contemporary United Kingdom, using it as a bit of a warning for where we might go. The Netherlands is by far not as bad as the UK, but you can function as a warning light. Right? Let's see where we do not want to go. As a warning light to think about inequality and whether we need to tackle it, I did try to provide 3 thoughts, which I hope stimulate some thinking, which is to think about poverty beyond money, to include need satisfaction, to think about relations between formal and informal care in this provision, and to remember the role of place in the access to services, facilities, but also family, friends, and neighbors to be able to make you meet your needs.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you very much, Xander. I think we have 10-15 minutes for discussion. So, Danny, perhaps you could...
I'll just do a tiny bit. Keep it short, but that's brilliant. Thank you so much. I sometimes... 3 of the 7 children are living in private rented. So have a landlord, their family has a landlord. We used to have a tiny private rented sector. And then we changed the law in the 80s so that tenants had almost no protection. And it grew. And it was supposed to grow for students and for young professionals. But the biggest growth, one of the biggest growth, was parents with children because they didn't have enough money to get a mortgage. And so they ended up in private renting. Now, in private renting, your landlord can send you a letter, and within 8 weeks you have to leave, or they can get somebody to evict you. So I don't think this is the case in the Netherlands. I don't think you can be evicted with 8 weeks' notice. And the easy way to evict somebody, you just put the rent up, double it, and they can't pay it, and then you go. So this is the slippery slope thing. Somebody might say, oh, the housing market isn't very efficient here. You need to let private landlords make more money, and then they'll build lots of houses, and it'll all be wonderful. Okay? And we've shown, and we never meant, when we liberalised private renting, the plan was never for it to be children. That wasn't what the Conservatives were thinking in the 80s. It's just that these things can happen if you take your eye off people's positions. I think over services, you're very right. It's so efficient to simply provide things that everybody needs rather than to get them to pay for it. But somebody has to pay for it, which is where the income of the top 6% matters. Because this top 6%, people like me, we have the money. And we're only worried about how each other are. Okay, it's a question about, can I go skiing at winter and have a holiday at Easter and another one in the summer? You tax me more and I'm down to 2 holidays rather than 3. I don't mind as long as the other professors are only having 2 holidays. Right? It's all comparative that matters. And last, basic human needs. We do a survey, which they can't do anymore in America. It's a breadline survey where we ask you, should a child be able to have a warm coat in winter? 99% of you probably say yes. Should they be able to have 2 pairs of shoes, not 1, 2? The old questions in 1968 were, should a family be able to afford meat once a week? Should you have a chair if somebody comes to visit? The new questions began to be, should they have a DVD player? And now, should a teenager be able to have a phone? There were always marginal items which are always argued about. For pensioners, by the way, it's should they be able to have a bird feeder? And the majority of people in Britain think that a pensioner should have an income that allows them to buy a wire bird feeder, but they shouldn't have enough money to put grain in it. If they want to put grain in for birds to eat, that should come out of their money. They should eat less. It's fascinating to ask people what other people should get. Most people say a child should be able to have a holiday. Approaching 40% of our children in the UK have no holiday. A holiday is very precisely defined. A holiday, a vacation, is 7 days, 6 nights, spent away from home, not staying with family or friends. That's a holiday. It used to be 30%, it's now 40% of our children have no holiday. My children probably cannot count the number of holidays they have in a year. The problem with holidays for somebody like me isn't money, it's can we get off work or school long enough for another holiday? And that's what incredible inequality brings you. And it's just wasteful. The last reply I'll say on cars. And it's great if you've got somebody else who can help you with a car. But again, there's a question of distribution. Yeah. We looked in Britain, this was 20 years ago, and in 20 years ago the census had a question which allowed us to know how many households had a certain number of people aged 17 or above. You have to be 17 to drive a car and pass the driving test. How many people 17 years old and above, and how many cars or vans did they own? So we could add up how many households in Britain had more cars than they could all drive at the same time. All right? There's one of you and you own 2 cars. You've got a spare car. And the interesting thing was that the number of spare cars owned by people rich enough to have multiple cars was almost exactly the same as the number of parents with children who had no car. And if you've been a parent and you've had children, the one time in your life it's really useful to have a car is when you have children. It's really, really hard to buy food and move things around without a car for children. And so you could be utopic about it. It's possible still in these countries to actually move things around, not increase the amount of money, make services more universal, but somebody has got to pay, and that paying has to come from the top. And that is what we did in the UK in the past. We taxed people at the top after 1918 the most to pay for the First World War. We carried on taxing them in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. So the reason that I grew up in the most equal country apart from Sweden in Europe was because we'd spent 50 years taking money away from the rich. The rich, when my grandfather was born, owned large country houses, and the most common job for women in the UK was to be a servant for rich people. And by the 1960s, there were no servants left. Almost nobody was a servant. And it took 50 years to create an equal society. The thing which I think is fascinating, Demetrius pointed to it earlier, is the rich in the UK by the 1960s were not sadder than they had been in the 1920s. right? These 1920s aristocrats weren't the happiest people in the world when you look at their lives. So greater equality actually benefits very well-off people. The rich in the 1920s, if you think back, something had just happened in Russia, and they thought it might happen to them. They were very, very scared, which was another reason why we became more equal, because there were people amongst the very rich, William Beveridge was one, many, who helped to make the country more equal because you never knew what might go wrong if you did treat most people this badly. But the danger is you learn to live with it. You learn to live with what you've got. You oppose a particular thing that's happening with a government, but then you lose and they get it through and you get used to it. And we've become used to the situation in the UK. People think it's normal. I do talks at schools and I tell school children that when I was their age, I didn't see young people on the streets homeless, and they think I'm lying, right? Because their parents are younger than me, and their parents saw people who were homeless. So it's tricky, and we need different ways of doing this or telling these stories. Yeah. Factual books, talks don't work. You need a way of getting into people's emotions and saying, this is what it feels like, and this is how much better it could be. And it really is not efficient to let some people have so much.
It reminds me of, I'm working with another UK scholar on the trajectory of austerity and the way it affected the austerities, like cutting budgets and raising taxes, which happened mainly in the years after the financial crisis, which had like a big influence on public services, benefits, etc., and especially affected poorer parts of society because in general they depend more on public services and public facilities because they cannot privately acquire them. Plus there was some reshifting of taxes that actually benefited more better of people. And here we try to take the ecological concept of shifting baseline system, right, where people find normal what they see when they're about 12 years old, and see how we can use that to not only think about how we understand austerity, but also when you want to counter austerity, what is it you desire for? Like if we desire now, do we desire back to how it was in 2008, or do we want to desire back to how it was in the 90s, the 80s, or whatever? And how do you try to re-evoke such imaginations of how things can be without also falling into, like you also said, things weren't perfect then either, right? How can you... Things becoming better should not mean necessarily going back, right? You should take what's good.
In a way, it's an opportunity to do things differently. So the UK, nobody ever planned for us to get the 1960s. Right? Nobody sat there. Most of our equality was won by 1939. But nobody actually sat there with a plan and said, let's try to get to this and see what happens. You know, we didn't think we were going to get the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but that wouldn't have happened without becoming that kind of a country. So you don't want to necessarily go back. You don't want to simply reinstate the things you've lost. The opportunity to do things very differently is there. But equally, the danger of becoming even more individualistic, even more it's just about me and my family, and not the others, and let's keep the foreigners out, and let's just look after ourselves. You know, that fear can be stoked up as you become more unequal. People become more scared. They act more for their children. We have the lowest social mobility in Europe, because if you're in the top 10%, you try as hard as you can to make sure your children are in the top 10%. Because the alternative is awful. Your child might become a nurse, which means a lifetime of poverty. Or they might marry a nurse. How can you avoid that? Well, you make sure they don't go to a school where people do those kind of jobs, because who needs nurses?
Thank you very much. I think this is really very interesting conversation and thought-provoking points. I think we should open the floor to everyone to ask questions, but I would like to start with, well, I can already see one of the volunteers from the Research Masters and Islands program in our Faculty of Special Sciences. I'd like to also say with them in a course designed by my good colleague, the director of the Rudolf Agricola School for Sustainable Development. So that's a good way of starting the discussion already. So we have two volunteers who will kick off the discussion, but I would like to ask everyone to come forward and ask questions, offer thoughts. So, Daniela, thank you. That's
better. Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. It was very insightful, but I started thinking about space, because you were talking about how this is not about space, to not, create this stereotype on locations. But actually, locations are very important, because usually the talk of inequality, when I see it, it only exists within the borders of a country. And I feel like the England is a very special case, because probably the inequality that you have now probably is only caused by yourself, because you are a very wealthy country, and, well, what happened didn't depend on other countries. But that's not what happens in most countries of the world. So, for instance, in the 1960s, Brazil wanted to be more equal and started to have more leftist policies. And then the United States, a wealthier country, installed a military dictatorship there. And then that created a very chaotic institutional hazard that exists till this day. And as a result, we don't have money to pay for researchers. So researchers there don't have enough scholarship to study. And what does Europe does? Erasmus Mundus. And then they attract all those poor researchers. And then what happens to Brazil? They have one less brain. Me. I'm here in the Netherlands. So yeah. So I wanted to ask how to actually tackle inequality, also considering inequality between countries. Because sometimes some policies to actually deal with the problems in Europe from these inequalities can harm other countries.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, I'll do very quickly. It wasn't just the First World War and us taxing the rich, which helped inequality begin to fall in the UK. It was also us losing the largest empire the world has ever known. Right? In 1920, we owned a third of the planet. And by we, that wasn't us all, that was the very rich in Britain. So we owned plantations, we owned investments, and we lost it all. And the rich lost it, which is partly why our equality rose, because the colonies gained their independence. And we made those colonies poor. British colonies are still some of the poorest places on the planet, because we were good at being bad. We are the most successful, devious European country at and really didn't benefit these. And we're all influenced by other countries. When we get influenced by politics in Brazil. When something interesting happens in Brazil, it kind of makes people think it's possible with an election and a different leader at the moment. You think things can happen. We were influenced by the United States. We didn't notice the United States becoming so powerful. The United States, their political class, hated our social housing program. Hated the fact that half our children were housed in council housing, because it was seen as the beginnings of a road to communism. This was being copied by other countries around the world, and the US really didn't like it. Didn't like our health system, socialized medicine either. Haven't completely got rid of that yet, but it's American healthcare companies that want to buy our NHS, or be given it, to run. So we've also suffered from the USA. But we can hardly complain about that because we created it, right? That the USA was the first colony to gain its independence. And it was when the USA gained its independence by terrorist action, as we called it. They called it a revolution. When the USA gained its independence, that's when we became really good at colonizing, because we didn't like losing our possessions.
I If I can also briefly respond. I think it's a very interesting and important question. I don't know exactly the Netherlands, Brazil dynamics so much, but I know it also plays within the European Union, where you had especially Southern Europe that was hit hard by the economic crisis of 2008. And as a result was, through several mechanisms, forced by, for example, the European Union to implement harsh austerity measures which tanked their economies. And what happened was that young, skilled, educated people looking for work couldn't find it. They started to look for work. They started coming to places like the Netherlands and Germany and work like dentists and academics. Like, look at them. Well, he was already in the UK when this happened. So this. But then what, of course, happens is that on the one hand, right, the skilled and the one that could maybe earn and pay taxes, they are lured to come to the Netherlands. And then they work here. They got someone. We didn't pay a single cent for their education, right? They got paid for by someone else. They come here. They start earning well. They start paying taxes. We take that. And then we say to Portugal and Greece, you should spend less money. Right? The money that they spend on education, people working now here, right? So there is the... but one of the things you could think about, right, is should there be a responsibility if we take young talent that went through 10, 12 years of education in Portugal to become a dentist here? Should there be a responsibility that the Netherlands then contributes to some of that education through some tax transfer? It won't happen in the current political climate, of course, but it is kind of a sort of resource extraction that is that's going on there. That further entrenches the inequalities between those countries that do exist. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to say I did my first degree in Greece, so not in the UK. But so thank you very much, Daniela. For those of you who don't know, Erasmus Mundus is a program of the European Union with scholarships aimed at mostly scholars from outside the European Union. So we have students here from India, Canada, Colombia, Burma, Peru, Ecuador. I lost count. Many countries. So United Nations. It's a very interesting program. But yeah, Daniela, thank you very much for taking volunteering and very interesting question. This is a program that is in the context of the research masters of the faculty, and we have a research master student who will ask the next question, Wouter Heinen, who is from the Netherlands. So Wouter, you could stay there if you want and use the volleyball or catch box or whatever you want to call this. And then after that, we would like to invite anyone to, if people raise your hands, I will keep a note. And yeah,
okay.
Wouter.
So once again, thanks for the presentation. And especially now when you once again refer to the point that we're nowadays basically at the same point for some people where we were in 1913 with the $1 is equal to what those people now make. But if you look at the world, it looks very different. We have had these huge globalization shifts, and we now have what now happens is that certain goods are constructed and made on the other side of the world because that is cheaper. And still, that hasn't made it necessarily easier for the people. I mean, also here in the Netherlands, until I think also the 50s, 60s, there was this huge textile industry in the east of the country. I know that my great-grandparents grew up in that, and they grew up in poverty in that regard. And now this is all made relatively cheap under maybe even worse circumstances than it was in the Netherlands on the other side of the world, and comes here cheaper. One would then expect that, or I would expect that the people here would then benefit from it, but apparently that doesn't seem to be the case. So to put it shortly, how has globalization influenced this poverty and this inequality issue?
It's a brilliant question and not easy to try to answer. It is quite remarkable how we have made a lot of innovations. I mean, the main one with textiles is more industrialization, more machines, not children in sweatshops necessarily doing it. Or my hometown, the most common job for a boy who was born when I was born was to go into the car factory. The car factory in Oxford employed 40,000. It was a horrible job, really noisy. The conveyor belt moved all the time, and you were under the car drilling it for hours, maybe 8 hours, and you couldn't stop the belt. that factory is still there. But now we have 1,200 beautiful robots. Each robot is no bigger than can be fitted into a lorry, a 12-foot lorry. So that if BMW ever wants to move the factory, it can move the factory in a week to the Czech border or wherever. We pay BMW 75 million not to move the factory from Oxford. But my point is, that factory is now making more cars than ever. A car every minute and 2 seconds. An electric Mini, so it's a kind of good car-ish, although cars are bad. You know that, you're here. It's a lovely city, keep the cars out. So why haven't people's lives got better when we've had so many more machines making things? And we can only wear one cardigan, one shirt. Greed. It's greed. Some of us are so greedy that we've worked really, really hard to make sure that the promise of the 1920s, John Maynard Keynes, that your children, your grandchildren will live a life of leisure and luxury. It's entirely possible. We mechanically farm. We don't require many people to actually work anymore doing things with their hands. And it's a greed of a few people who want more and more money for themselves and do not want the majority of the population working for only 15 or 10 hours a week. That is as simple as that. It's not controlling the greed of people who tell you that no other way is possible. So we now have people working 2 or 3 jobs at a time. School teachers in my city, because they can't afford the rent on what they're paid, because it's expensive. In the evenings, I meet the school teachers pulling pints in a pub. So they're working until 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and then they're being teachers again in the morning. Right? And it is simply due to greed, sadly, and our collective inability to spot it. Yeah.
It's interesting that you mention Keynes, because I think one of the things he mentions is or his vision is that around this time we should worry about what to do with our free time, right?
Yeah.
He imagined that productivity would rise so much that we maybe only needed to work 15 hours a week to be able to satisfy our needs. And I think even in the UK, I think the New Economics Foundation did a report in 2011 when unemployment was high, and they said, let's say that we produce enough value for everyone to live well, if it was distributed equally. Let's take everyone that's working and that's willing to work and then just divide the total number of work that's done by the number of people that's looking for work. And then they did some further calculations, because then if people would work less, then you would need less childcare and blah, blah, blah. And they came to the conclusion that in 2011, it would be possible to uphold the British standard of living if everyone would work 21 hours a week.
Yeah.
And this also shows something about the distribution, right? Because of course, if you do that on the current minimum wage and current wages, that doesn't work, because 21 hours a week doesn't pay enough. So it should still have to come with redistribution. But it's another way to indicate kind of the inequality of income.
I should say some things have got better. So compared to Keynes' time when 1 or 2% went to university, tiny.
Yeah.
In the UK, partly because of the market, we have 65% of people going to university by age 30. 2/3 of people go to university. Most of them going to at least age 21, 22. Now, you could call that leisure, and it should be leisure, but we've managed to arrange our universities so that our students are so worried about exams or what they're going to do, that our students often say, it's so hard to be a university student that I need to be paid twice as much as average when I get a job, right? But that enormous expansion of education is a little bit of Keynes' thing, and pensions. When Keynes was writing, most people didn't make it to 65 or shortly after. Now, a huge number of us get to spend decades of, in theory, leisure time. So we have got halfway there, but we've managed to arrange it in such a way that we're not happy with it, and that we don't recognise the leisure we should have as leisure, and that people have fears they do not need to have.
Okay, thank you, Wouter. I think we can open the discussion to more questions. I think I saw someone in the front. Yes, the lady in the front.
Sorry, I didn't see the hand. Moet hij... Oh, sorry. Ik dacht... Yeah, it's quite interesting discussion to follow. I have a few questions to ask concerning the first speaker stated that greed is the culprit of the fabric of society being the victims of decisions made by the few that has access to the resources. And yeah, it's quite interesting to hear academics talking about in a fictional manner, because I'm quite asking how is it not so relatable anymore? It's like that you have to resort to a theatrical approach to get the people to get to know and to get aware of problems that is currently facing society at large, world at large, England, or whether it's in the Netherlands, a little less in Netherlands, but there are also a lot of measures in place to help people to not go over the edge, as to say. So there are things, but I'm just quite like interested, like because I'm really like interested in theatrical stuff. So I was like wondering, for an academic, it's always a little bit of a abstract concept to resort, like everything should be explained and how, yeah. So I'm just I'm really interested how you came to that.
I'll do a short answer, and then you can do a better one on that. Thank you. I maybe said it a bit quickly about greed, but I've spent 30 years looking at inequality. Countries that do well are ones who control their greedy. So the Nordic countries, particularly Finland, have control. They have everywhere has people who are greedy. They've worked out how to control their greedy at the moment, and they do well. The UK, we controlled greedy people at certain points and didn't. There were always people who want more. And when you look at what is it that happens, wealth distribution is really interesting, because wealth inequality is quite high in many countries that are quite equal by income. But you do things like say, yes, you can own that land, yes, you can be wealthy, but people have got a right to walk across it, and by the way, you've got to build a path for them. But don't worry, it's still yours, okay? So different European countries have different ways of dealing with the wealthy. But the danger is, it's how do you control greed? And the worst thing that can happen is if you say, the greedy are really good, and they will make us all rich. And the best of them is somebody called Elon Musk.
Yes,
and
I was actually thinking about it.
And he will get us to Mars, and then we can expand. You know, then that's where it leads to. The fictional thing, in the more equal countries, you don't need as much fiction. People are actually more numerate, and they're able to use non-fiction, and they will complain about poverty. So in the countries with the least poverty in Europe, people complain the most about it, which is why it's so low. Once things go wrong, you have to begin to tell stories again. And we told stories 100 years ago. It was mainly fiction through which we addressed poverty and inequality. It was stories. It was Charles Dickens in the case of England. Yeah. It was Brideshead Revisited. It's a series of references. The stories particularly used children. In Dickens' character, two of the children in the Christmas Carol, if you know that, it's going to be shown at Christmas Carol, always good, were called, their names were Want and Ignorance. And Want and Ignorance were two of the parts of the Beveridge Report in 1942, Want being poverty, ignorance being education. So it came from a fictional story. But when things get really bad, you have to tell stories.
I think you can also, so you both touched upon it, that I tried using theatrical methods as a way of doing research in the past year. It's very interesting. One of the things I tried to do was to get people living in poverty and people trying to help them, so say social workers, together in a workshop and try to show some of their experience of the interaction between people in poverty and social workers from both groups, and try to make a scene that would show this frustration, and then ask the other what they would do differently, how they would respond to this, and then intervene, like become an actor in the play themselves. And that opened up, suddenly, for example, people living in poverty would reenact a scene which included social workers, that social workers would recognize, but then from a different perspective, for a different moment where things went wrong, and this kind of seeing it storified, seeing it as a fiction, seeing it as a scene with the potential to intervene, was really helpful to open up perspectives and see things from new angles. And I think this is another exercise of trying to use kind of different perspectives on reality and seeing what it means for different people to open up these views.
Okay.
Okay, I would like to ask for another question, and I would like to prioritize, if possible, to have someone who is not an academic or a student, if given that Student General is also open to. So I think if there's anyone who is not an academic or a student wants to ask a question, I would like to give them priority. If not, I think there's one in the back. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an academic though, but I would like to hear more about the role of socialization, especially here in the Netherlands. I heard Danny talk a lot about the study environment, and also that 2/3 of the people are going to university. So also in the university level, but I know that here in the Netherlands it changes a lot already at the high school and lower school levels. Mm-hmm. The school you go to and how you're socialized there will determine a lot of your outcomes. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, and maybe also in comparison about the UK.
Okay.
Because you touched upon how it was when you were growing up and the kind of schooling system that was there, but not so much about the current situation. So
Yeah.
I'm curious.
So university, 100 years ago, 1%. For my cohort, it was around about 10%. Now it's 65%. This is partly, we removed number controls in the year 2012 and allowed universities to take any number and charge the highest fees in the world, higher than the USA. People always try and claim, not we actually, the median and mean university fee in England is higher than in America than anywhere on the planet. What happens is you get 65% of young people going to university at some point. The promise is they'll be rich, but they are 2/3 of the population. So the only way they can be well off is if we turn the other third into slaves, right? And we're not going to manage to do that. Also, the other third can do really useful things, like they can fix the lights in this room, right? They can actually practically, they're electricians, they're plumbers, they're builders, they... about how, so the difficulty is, when you become unequal, you tend to go to school with people like you. And you'll tend, there may be differences and you think the differences, but you'll tend to get fused. So one example I can do is we do surveys across Europe of the opinions of young adults. And the opinions of young adults tend to be very progressive. They hate sexism, they hate racism, they hate transphobia, they love the environment. The only thing that young university graduates across Europe are not progressive about is that they do believe they should be paid more than other people because they've gone to university. But even that varies. So in a country like England, they really believe they should be paid more. Whereas in the most equal country in Europe, Finland, university graduates say just a tiny bit more. Okay? Whereas I say, because I'm a hippie, it's an incredible privilege to go to university. You're 20, 21 years old and you're not having to stack shelves at a supermarket. And the idea you should be paid more, or, and you can tell imagine if you go to university and they teach you how to stop people dying. They give you a degree in medicine, right? And you have the best gift always in human society is to be taught how to relieve pain, suffering, and stop people dying. To then say, I need to be paid so very much because I spent 5, 6, 7 years learning this, right? And we get things the wrong way around. I'm quite happy, by the way, to pay doctors more than anybody else in the society, because it's an awful life having to spend your life with sick and ill people, by the way. But you don't need to pay doctors more than twice as much, the average. As long as they're paid more than everybody else, they're happy. So you just pay doctors more than bankers, you only have to pay them twice the average, and they can spend a life dealing with illness, and they can still be happy people. And that was the UK in the 1970s.
Yeah. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on schools and school socialization, but you see that I mentioned in my response also to not only talk about poverty, but also about social exclusion. And you can see the effects of social exclusion come into effect in a quite young age. I think you also mentioned it in your first chapter, people not being able to host a birthday party, people not inviting friends. Maybe at a later age when your friends go for a drink on Friday after school when you can't afford and you have to go home. This means that sometimes people might seclude themselves. What you sometimes see is people cling to a family, which is like a small group that's kind of loyal and trusts each other, which in the long run might maybe not be so beneficial because you exclude yourself. So this is definitely a role where poverty starts to influence this. There are attempts to try to encourage this with mixed schooling, but that always works to a certain extent, and others not. Yeah. I think it is very important. You want?
Yeah, I'd love. I do. It's too. One real difficulty we have in the UK is this 7% who go to private schools, particularly a seventh of them who go to the really, really expensive ones, 60, 70, 80,000 pounds a year. Imagine your parents have sent you a school that costs that much. What you're basically told is, you're really clever, it's good for society if we spend all that money on you because you're going to lead the world. Now, changing your mind, deciding actually your parents didn't understand that, you're no different to anybody else, you're not special, and it was largely a waste of money, is really difficult to do. And I have real sympathy for Britain's upper class. Really sympathy, because they've been segregated like white South Africans under apartheid in South Africa. Imagine trying to understand the lives of black folk in South Africa if you never met any apart from the servant, right? And that's the problem with segregation. And you can't recreate your childhood, which is why the segregation is so awful.
Okay, I'm really tempted to go on because I'm Greek and we have a really relaxed approach to time, but we are in the Netherlands, so I'm afraid we have to come to a close. But I would like to say that we will hang around for a bit, so if people want to ask informally questions, please do this in the end. But before we close, I would like to say I'm very grateful, very many thanks to Nina Dieters, Astrid Bakker, Studium Generale and Rudolf Agricola School, and Franz Sitzma, who unfortunately couldn't be here, the director of the school. And of course, Danny Dorling, Xander van Lanen, thank you so much, and everyone for being here. Thank you so much, and we will be around for a bit. Thanks.
Great. Now I just have to do, if I do this quickly, I have it all done. Go on.
I'm not allowed to ask it anymore. But if I hear your stories or your story, what do we do to change things around?